My friends, as the mayor of Muddy York in outer space, we're going to take our discourse to new levels of stratospheric intensity and elucidation and clarity, hopefully. So, the latest venture is Star Trek and the question of space. And I'd like to lay out this thesis about space, referring to a structure, organizational structure first propounded by Buckminster Fuller, I believe in the 1970s, I think, and also Kenneth Sneed along with that. So the structure is called tensegrity, and tensegrity is a portmanteau of integrity and tension. Integrity and tension. So this structure called a structure exhibiting properties of tensegrity it possesses both integrity and tension, and it holds itself through this tension. So you have a network of continuous pressure, and within that structure you have struts or elements that are compressed and sort of float in this sea of tension, of pressure. So I'm going to call the elements, the particular elements, serial linear time, and this network of constant pressure I'm going to call the all-time or all-tone. So other people have applied this to the very structure of the human body so that our bones actually don't touch each other, but they're in the fascia of muscles, which corresponds to these sort of compressed structures. And so they float in this sort of network of tension exhibited by the tendons. Anyway, so now the interesting question here is, how could this sort of metaphysical conception, which is actually rooted in sound architectural principles as propounded by Buckminster Fuller, how can this idea of space, looking at serial linear time as space, we're looking at sort of time and space, we're fitting serial linear time within this space of structures exhibiting tensegrity. How does this idea, I, the mayor of Muddy York in outer space, apply to mundane earthly issues? For example, when in my mayoral walk along the city, I noticed that in abandoned places, such as the former Guardian drugstore on Queen Street, the space was now occupied by homeless people. So as my friend and campaign manager Jared said to me, aha, that's what happens when space becomes abandoned. It's then occupied or filled in or taken over, appropriated by others who would otherwise not be there. So we have sort of mundane space and rural historical space in which people occupy space and so forth, like the Occupy movement of 2010. And then we have time within the space of the all-tone, or the all-tense. So how can we understand that? Also, my good friend and campaign manager, Jared, said to me that he talked about perception, asked me questions about perception. He was reading an author who said that, according to this author, perception is an all-body experience. And I agree with that understanding of things. And so I say that the brain is where all these sort of senses of the body, proprioception, which means how the body perceives itself, as well as perception regarding the sensible five senses, are all sort of brought to a head in the brain, the neural network. And this neural network then constantly interacts with sound waves, and it modulates. To modulate is to change scale. So energy changes scale. So we see that the brain has different levels of consciousness, different levels of perceptual awareness, you could say, going from the lowest delta, I believe, to alpha waves, or gamma waves rather. So you're going from levels of basically being asleep to levels of wakefulness, and somehow the gamma rays are the highest, most conscious aware level. That's when ideas are really rolling and rocking and so forth. So the brain is modulated by sound waves. Like the brain is a sort of like a radio receiver. As you know, signals are sent to the radio and the radio picks it up. And so the brain not only receives signals from where you you could ask, but it also works on these signals. It modulates them. It changes and shifts them. And the product of this activity of brain modulation and brain being modulated by, I call the mind. So the mind is nothing more than how energy signals, you might say, are modulated by the brain and are modulated in turn by the brain. So the brain is not just simply a passive receptacle, as radio analogy might make things appear, but the brain is actually also interacting with and saying something in return, so to speak, to the signals. So the mind is nothing more than that. And imagine that without this sort of modulation and modulated by the brain, what we'd have is a test pattern, which is simply sort of vacuum fluctuations, random vacuum fluctuations of infinite energy, but there'd be no picture. That would be called a test pattern. That's the mind. That's the brain without a mind. So the brain only becomes to have a mind when it's stimulated by, you might say, its immediate sensory environment. And in fact, experiments have shown that people, for example, who were born blind, and later, because the retinas were a problem, and later they received retina transplants, something like this, they're able to actually have the optical equipment to see. They found they still could not see because actually the brain has to be programmed to receive and make sense of sensory input. So it's not just simply we open our eyes and we see things. It's actually because the brain, as I said, is sort of modulating these energy waves, and it's being worked upon, and therefore the brain is sort of preparing itself to see things. And so it's not just mechanical perception, not just simply mechanically done or performed, but rather perception is the product of an interrelated process of brain wave modulation, an exchange of energy that comes in and goes out and becomes transformed through the neural networks into what we call the mind. So, you can see this. What does it have to do with space? Well, one thing that's obvious here is that the brain could be considered a sort of space. So just as the city is sort of space, the world space of the city, so the brain could be considered neurological space. So if that's how perception works, if that's how sort of consciousness works, how can we apply this? I say, as the mayor of muddy Toronto, how can we apply this to the city itself? How could the city be perceived of as a brain? So the brain is like the urban structure here. And in Latin you have civitas, which means civic, which means city, and you have urbs, U-R-B-S, which is the root of the word urban. So urban structure refers to the built-up material things. Civitas refers to the civic spirit, which is not material. But it's not immaterial either. It's not material, but it still matters. And as we know, I say to you, Mayor of Muddy York, that what we know about matter in terms of the Mobius strip is that when a quark spins, it creates a Mobius strip, and the Mobius strip is the space, here's space again, of two note chords. Just as a torus is the space of three note chords. So there you go. Space pops up again as the very issue. So I would say that the civic spirit, the civitas, has to do with how we modulate the energy. And out of that modulation, we create the city. So you might say that the brain is the herbs for which the modulation of the energy is the civitas, is the spirit. So spirit really refers to, in my conception of things, I say the mayor of Muddy York, how the brain, the sort of radio receiver, receives and modulates input. So civic spirit refers to the modulation, the dynamics of that modulation to create the urban structure, which is our world reality. So the energy represented by the brain waves becomes concretized as the urban structure. And don't forget, my friends, that energy is nothing more than matter, highly pitched, high frequency matter. Conversely, matter is low-pitched energy. So there's a dialectic, E equals mc squared, as Einstein said. Energy is low-pitched, is high-pitched matter. Matter is low-pitched energy. So the civic spirit then, my friends, I say to you as mayor of New York, refers to the dynamics of modulating that energy, the energy of the all-time or the all-tone. That's what it comes down to, how we modulate the energy of the all-tone, the vibrant, ever-present stillness of what is, how we modulate that, and then how that modulation of energy becomes concretized, abstracted, and becomes the urban structure that we call a city. But what we don't see, but which is certainly not immaterial, is in fact the dynamics of energy modulation. And that refers to, in Plato's terms, the forms. So the modulation of the energy refers to, is channeled by implicit notions we have of justice and truth and beauty. So that's where the contemplation of the forms is so necessary and vital. I say to you, the mayor of Muddy York, that we need to think through how we think about thinking, or meta-thinking, or metaphysics. So that the physics refers to the urban built-up structure, the metaphysics refers to the civic spirit informing the building up of those structures. And what informs the building up of those structures, my friends, is in fact the contemplating of what Plato called the form. So justice, truth, beauty, all these elements, you might say, are forms in Plato's mind that then become the implicit assumptions upon which we build things. So in Greek mythology, for example, cities were named after the gods. So Athens was named after Athena, the goddess of wisdom. So the god, certainly not immaterial for the Greeks, but not physical either. So the gods represent the civic spirit informing the birth, genesis, and growth and development of a city. They represent the end of the city. They represent the telos of the city. They represent the virtue of the city, what that city aspires to, what that city sort of, its being, its beingness. So the city is not just simply defined by, being on a lake, for example, like Toronto, or I should say Muddy York, and people coming to Lake Ontario because it's a good place to trade, a good place to meet. There's something more in play here, which is the very spirit of the place. Because the native people, although they did come here and they called Toronto the meeting place, they also had a notion, animistic origin, notion of the spirits that inform things, that inform what we call nature, which is sort of information. But information is always interpreted, so the interpretation of information relies upon the forms. So, anything that material and physical is actually built up metaphysically through the interpretations of forms that it concretizes. So nothing is strictly speaking physical, because to the physical actually is in fact the metaphysical. So, as I say to you, the mayor of Muddy York, overlooking the lake here, that to really recover our health and well-being, our virtue, we must understand the spirit which informs the building up of the actual place, Ontario Place. So in understanding what builds up the place, we must understand the form. So there's a sort of conversation then between the build-up called the urban structure or Ontario Place and what places Ontario in the universe itself. What is the cosmic beingness of Ontario as manifested by its capital, Toronto, as I would say, Muddy York. So Toronto still remains sort of Muddy York, still remains unfinished, in process, a work in process, because we are ever contemplating the forms of virtue, truth, and justice, out of which gives rise to our actual buildings.